In 1997, Cessna rolled the first new Skyhawk off the line in over a decade. Pilots were ecstatic. The industry was supposed to come back. A working professional could finally walk into a dealer, write a check, and fly home in a brand new airplane again. That was 28 years ago. Today, Cessna builds a few hundred Skyhawks a year. The average American flight school is training students in airplanes older than the instructors teaching them. And a pilot who wants to buy new in 2026 is looking at $400,000 for the same basic airframe his grandfather could have had for $25,000. The lawsuit crisis got fixed. The factories reopened, the planes came back, so why didn't the buyers? If you've ever stood in a hangar next to a 40-year-old Cessna and wondered why nobody is building something better for less, this video is for you. Hit subscribe before we get into it because this one goes deep, and the answer is not what most people think. When Russell Meyer stood next to Bill Clinton at the GARA signing ceremony in 1994, he made a promise: pass this law and Cessna will build airplanes again. Jobs will come back to Kansas. The industry will be reborn. He kept that promise. In 1997, the first new Cessna 172R rolled out of a brand new factory in Independence, Kansas. Pilots who had waited over a decade for this moment finally had something to celebrate. Then they saw the price tag, $140,000, not for a turboprop, not for a retractable gear cross-country machine, for a Cessna 172, 4 seats, fixed gear, same Lycoming engine that had been turning since the Eisenhower administration, $140,000. In 1978, a new Skyhawk had cost $25,000. Adjusted for inflation, that was about $115,000 in 1997 dollars. So before a single customer complained, before a single airplane had even been delivered, the new Skyhawk was already priced above what inflation alone could explain. And nobody in the industry wanted to say that out loud. Industry analysts pointed to liability costs, lower production volumes, and certification overhead. All of that was true. But pilots didn't care about the explanation. They cared about the number. And the number felt like a betrayal. What nobody said at the time was that the industry had used the restart as a quiet reset. A decade of shutdown had erased all the price anchors. There were no competing dealers, no end-of-year clearance sales, no factory incentives. Cessna was essentially the only game in town for new single-engine certified aircraft, and the price reflected that monopoly. By 2005, the Skyhawk was $200,000. By 2015, $310,000. By 2024, $400,000 base. The price climbed every single year, regardless of inflation, regardless of demand, regardless of what pilots could actually afford. The restart that was supposed to save General Aviation had quietly priced out the very people it was meant to serve. Here is the calculation that killed the new airplane market. Not the lawsuit crisis, not the insurance collapse. This one spreadsheet that every serious pilot eventually ran. Option A, buy a 1978 Cessna 172 with a freshly overhauled engine, decent paint, and a new Garmin Navigator. Cost around $65,000. Annual insurance, roughly $1,200. Engine reserve, money you set aside every flight hour for the next overhaul, about $15 per hour. Expected useful life before major work, another 20 years minimum if you maintain it properly. Option B, buy a new 2005 Cessna 172S. Cost $200,000, same insurance bracket, same engine reserve calculation because it's the same basic Lycoming engine family, same airframe life expectancy because it's the same airframe. The performance difference between the two airplanes is negligible. The 2005 model has fuel injection and a nicer interior. The 1978 model has a carburetor and slightly worn upholstery. Both cruise at around 122 knots. Both carry roughly the same useful load. Both land at the same airports at the same speeds. The price difference is $135,000. No rational person could justify that gap. And pilots, almost by definition, are people who do the math. They calculate weight and balance before every flight. They calculate fuel burns to the tenth of a gallon. They are not people who ignore a $135,000 discrepancy because the carpet smells new. The used market didn't just compete with new airplanes. It made new airplanes look absurd. And once pilots internalized that, really sat with it, the new airplane market for ordinary buyers was essentially over. There is a question that every Cessna salesperson has dreaded for 30 years. A prospective buyer walks into the showroom, looks at the $400,000 Skyhawk on the floor, and asks it quietly, "Isn't this basically the same airplane from the 1950s? The honest answer is yes, mostly. The Cessna 172 first flew in 1955. The airframe that went into production in 1956, the wing shape, the cabin width, the tail design, the tricycle gear, is still in production today. The engine went from a Continental O300 to a Lycoming IO 360. The gauges went from steam to Garmin glass. The interior got quieter, but the fundamental engineering is 7 decades old. The wingspan is the same, the cabin is the same size. The cruise speed is roughly the same. A pilot who flew a 1965 Cessna 172 could climb into a 2024 model and feel immediately at home, which sounds like a compliment until you realize you're paying $400,000 for that familiarity. Compare that to any other industry. A $400,000 car in 2024 is a different species compared to one from 1995. A $400,000 boat has composite construction, modern diesel engines, and electronics that would have looked like science fiction in 1978. The Cessna 172 has a Garmin touchscreen. The rest of it is the same airplane your grandfather considered buying. Pilots noticed. And the ones who noticed most clearly were the ones who quietly closed their checkbooks and walked back to the used market. Something strange started happening to old airplanes in the 2000s. They started going up in value, not adjusted for inflation, in raw dollars. A 1978 Cessna 172 that sold for $25,000 new and could be bought used in the early 1990s for around $30,000 was selling for $60,000 by 2005. By 2015, $80,000. By 2026, a clean example with a mid-time engine routinely trades for $100,000 or more. Try finding another consumer product from 1978 that sells today for 4 times its original price in nominal dollars. Not many candidates. What happened was simple supply and demand with a twist. The supply of good used airplanes was fixed. Nobody was building new, affordable ones. Every year, a few airframes were lost to accidents, corrosion, or hangar collapses. The pool of airworthy 1970s Cessnas shrank slowly but steadily, and the demand from pilots who couldn't or wouldn't pay $400,000 for a new one stayed constant or grew. The result was appreciation, which sounds like good news if you own one, but it created a brutal feedback loop for everyone else. Flight schools own fleets of training airplanes. When those airplanes appreciate, the school's asset values go up. But so does the cost of replacing them. A flight school that bought a 172 for $40,000 in 1995 and sells it today for $90,000 still has to buy another airplane to replace it, and that replacement costs $90,000. The school hasn't gotten richer. It's just running on a treadmill that gets faster every year. Rental rates follow. When the airplane is worth more, the school charges more per hour to cover its investment. When rental rates go up, fewer students can afford to fly. When fewer students fly, the pilot pool shrinks, and a shrinking pilot pool means fewer future buyers of any airplane, new or used. The appreciation paradox didn't fix the market. It quietly strangled it. By the early 2000s, the FAA knew something had to give. The affordable trainer was dead. The pilot population was aging. Student starts were declining. So in 2004, regulators did something genuinely creative. They invented a new category of airplane, light sport aircraft, LSA, simpler to certify, simpler to fly. A sport pilot license required only 20 hours of flight time versus 40 for a private license. No medical certificate required if you held a valid driver's license. And manufacturers could bring new designs to market faster and cheaper than the traditional Part 23 certification process allowed. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was complicated. A wave of small manufacturers, many of them European companies that had been building light aircraft for years without the American liability hangover, flooded the market. The Czech sport cruiser arrived from Kunovice with composite construction and a Rotax 912 engine that sipped fuel at half the rate of a Lycoming. Flight Design's CTLS, built in Germany, offered a glass cockpit and side-by-side seating for under $130,000. The Remos GX came out of Bavaria with carbon fiber spars and an airframe lighter than anything Cessna had ever certified. Suddenly, there were dozens of options under $150,000. Pilots bought them, but not in the numbers anyone hoped for. The restrictions built into the Sport Pilot Certificate undermined the whole category. Sport pilots couldn't fly at night, they couldn't carry more than one passenger. They faced airspace limitations that full private pilots didn't. For a student who wanted a real private certificate eventually, the Sport Pilot pathway felt like a dead end. Many flight schools didn't restructure their programs around it, and the manufacturers who entered the market discovered that the American liability environment hadn't really changed. Smaller companies with thinner margins couldn't absorb legal costs the way Cessna could. Several LSA makers quietly exited. Flight Design, one of the most promising, the company that had brought the CTLS to market, filed for insolvency in 2024. The affordable trainer revolution the FAA had designed the category to spark never arrived. The bottom of the market stayed broken. While everyone was watching the LSA experiment stumble, a company in Duluth, Minnesota was quietly rewriting what a new airplane could be and who would buy it. Cirrus Aircraft started delivering the SR-20 in 1999. Composite airframe, side stick controls, a full airframe parachute, a rocket-deployed canopy that could lower the entire plane to the ground in an emergency, and an all-glass Avidyne avionics suite that made traditional round-gauge panels look antique overnight. It was also expensive. The SR-20 started at around $150,000. The SR-22, the faster four-seat version, launched at $180,000 and climbed steadily. Today, a fully equipped SR-22 runs close to $700,000. Cirrus found buyers, lots of them. The company became the best-selling manufacturer of piston aircraft in the world. But look carefully at who was writing the checks. Not flight students, not weekend hobbyists, not the engineer who wanted to fly his family to the lake on a Saturday. The Cirrus buyer was a physician, an attorney, a tech executive, someone for whom $700,000 was a serious but manageable purchase, and who valued the parachute system as a safety margin that justified the premium. The CAPS parachute wasn't just a safety feature. It was a permission structure. It let a busy professional who flew 100 hours a year tell himself and his spouse that the risk was acceptable. Cirrus proved that you absolutely can sell new airplanes in America. You just can't sell them to average people anymore. The market that survived is a luxury market, dressed up in aviation vocabulary. That's not a resurrection of General Aviation. That's a different industry using the same airports. The hardest part of this story to put into numbers is the part that matters most. The culture broke. In the 1970s, learning to fly was something a middle-class American could reasonably aspire to. Flight schools were in small towns. Local airports had clubhouses. Flying clubs pooled resources so that a school teacher or a factory supervisor could share ownership of a Piper Cherokee with 3 other guys and fly on weekends. Aviation magazines ran ads for airplanes the way car magazines ran ads for Chevrolets, as aspirational but achievable objects. That world is gone. Talk to any flight instructor who has been in the business for more than 20 years and you hear the same story. In the 1980s and 90s, students came in because they wanted to fly. Today, the majority of new enrollments are building hours toward an airline career. The path to the airlines became the dominant reason to learn to fly because it was the only path that made financial sense. Spending $80,000 to fly a 40-year-old Cessna on weekends with no return on that investment became increasingly hard to justify to yourself and impossible to explain to a partner. The social infrastructure collapsed with it. Flying clubs that once had 50 members now struggle with 15. Local fly-ins that drew hundreds of airplanes in the 1970s now draw a few dozen. The airport diner that used to be full on Saturday mornings is now a vending machine in an empty lobby. The average age of an active general aviation pilot in America is now over 45 and climbing every year. The people who fly for fun are mostly people who learned before the collapse, and they are not being replaced at anywhere near the rate they are retiring or dying. When a hobby loses a generation, it doesn't just shrink. It loses the people who would have recruited the next generation, the mentor who would have taken a curious teenager up for a discovery flight, the club member who knew which 172 was a good deal and which one had a history. The culture that sustained general aviation as a normal middle-class activity was worn away slowly over decades, and there is no obvious mechanism to rebuild it. So here's where things actually stand. The buyers didn't come back because the math never worked again. A new airplane costs what a house costs for a design that predates the Apollo program. The used market offers the same performance for a fraction of the price. The cultural pull that once made flying feel like a reasonable thing for an ordinary person to pursue has been weakening for 40 years, and nothing has been strong enough to reverse it. Electric aviation is coming. Pipistrel, Buy Aerospace, and a dozen well-funded startups are working on certified trainers with lower operating costs. The FAA's updated Part 23 rules, revised in 2017, were specifically designed to make it easier to bring new designs through certification. There are real, concrete reasons to believe something could eventually change. But here is what 4 decades of optimism in general aviation looks like on the ground. The fleet keeps aging, the pilot population keeps contracting, and the affordable new airplane keeps not arriving. Every few years, a new design or a new regulation is going to fix everything. None of them have. The pilot walking out to a 1978 Skyhawk on a Saturday morning isn't holding on to the past out of sentimentality, he's holding on to it because the economics of every alternative are worse. The airplane that cost $25,000 new is still flying because nothing has come along that makes more sense to own. Not the new Cessna, not the LSA, not the kit plane in the garage, unless you have 5 years and 10,000 square feet to spare. The market that existed in 1978 wasn't just a product. It was a set of conditions: affordable manufacturing, broad demand, accessible insurance, a culture that treated flight as something normal people did. Those conditions assembled slowly over decades. They were dismantled faster than anyone thought possible, and they have not in any meaningful sense been reassembled.